It didn't come with ceremony, no announcement, no warning. Just a quiet directive issued from behind closed doors, one that would permanently redraw the lines of power inside the royal family. When Prince William signed off on the decision, even senior aides hesitated before carrying it out. Because this wasn't routine protocol. This was a line being drawn. And Camilla's family had just found themselves on the wrong side of it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the order moved through the palace not as a discussion, but as a conclusion, something already decided long before it ever reached the desks of those expected to enforce it. One moment, names existed quietly within internal guest registries, embedded into the rhythm of private visits and extended stays. The next, those same names were being erased with a precision that left no room for interpretation. Insiders whisper that staff were instructed with unusual clarity, no exceptions, no informal allowances, no quiet reversals behind closed doors. It was final. And what unsettled many wasn't just the decision itself, but the speed at which it unfolded. Security teams reportedly received updated clearance lists within hours, administrative systems were scrubbed, and long-standing informal privileges, those invisible threads that often go unnoticed, were suddenly severed. There was confusion at first. Not chaos, but a controlled kind of uncertainty. Aides exchanged careful glances, aware that something significant had shifted but unwilling to speak it aloud. Because within the monarchy, silence often speaks louder than any official statement. And this silence carried weight. Sources close to royal correspondence began hinting that this was not an isolated adjustment, not a minor tightening of protocol, but something deeper, something rooted in a growing discomfort that had been quietly ignored for far too long. For weeks, perhaps even months, there had been murmurs. Small inconsistencies, subtle signs that the balance between tradition and personal influence was beginning to tilt. At first, it was easy to dismiss. After all, royal life has always existed in a delicate space between public duty and private relationships. But what happens when that balance begins to shift too far? What happens when access, something so tightly guarded for generations, starts to blur at the edges? Those familiar with palace operations suggest that William had been watching closely, not reacting impulsively, but observing patterns, noting changes, and waiting. Waiting for the moment when action would no longer be avoidable. And when that moment came, it didn't explode into the open. It didn't need to. Because the most powerful decisions inside the royal institution are rarely loud, they are quiet, deliberate, and absolute. And this one carried a message that extended far beyond a single directive. It spoke of boundaries, of control, of a future being shaped not by compromise, but by clarity. A future where access is not assumed but earned, and where even those closest to power are not immune to its limits. But this wasn't a spontaneous decision, it was the culmination of tensions that had been quietly building for years. Behind the grandeur of royal residences lies something far more powerful than bricks and land. They are symbols of legitimacy, access, and control. And for generations, those spaces were guarded with near sacrosanct precision. So when new names began appearing within those walls, names not bound by royal blood questions started forming long before action was taken. Reports suggest that places like Balmoral, Sandringham, and Clarence House were never simply homes. They were sanctuaries of continuity, spaces where the weight of history dictated who could enter and who must remain outside. For decades, access to these estates followed an unspoken code, one rooted not just in protocol but in the very idea of what the monarchy represented. Insiders whisper that even distant relatives of the royal bloodline were expected to adhere to strict limitations, their presence carefully timed, their stays deliberately brief, their access quietly monitored. Because within these walls, presence is power, and power, once extended, is rarely without consequence. But over time, something began to shift. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A name added here, an invitation extended there. Camilla's family, once positioned firmly on the periphery of royal life, reportedly began appearing more frequently within these guarded spaces. Not in grand public displays, but in the quiet, private moments that rarely reach the outside world. Small gatherings, informal visits, extended stays that blurred the line between guest and fixture. Those familiar with palace operations suggest that these appearances were initially viewed through a lens of tolerance and acknowledgement of personal relationships within an institution that has always struggled to separate the private from the public. But tolerance, as history often shows, has its limits. And it was within these subtle shifts that unease began to grow. Senior royals, according to various interpretations, did not react immediately. They observed, they measured, they waited. Because in an institution built on patience and precedent, reaction is rarely immediate, it is calculated. Staff, however, found themselves in a more difficult position. Administrative aides reportedly began questioning internal records, noticing patterns that did not align with long-standing norms. Security personnel, tasked with enforcing boundaries that were once clear, found those same boundaries becoming increasingly difficult to define. What was once a straightforward distinction between royal and non-royal presence was becoming something far more complicated. And in that complexity, tension quietly took root. Media insiders, drawing from what they describe as palace-adjacent conversations, began hinting at a growing discomfort that extended beyond mere protocol. They spoke of a shift, not just in who was present, but in what that presence represented. Because when individuals without direct ties to the royal bloodline begin to occupy spaces so deeply tied to its identity, the question is no longer about hospitality. It becomes a question of legitimacy, of influence, of whether the invisible lines that have defined the monarchy for centuries are beginning to fade. And once those lines begin to blur, restoring them becomes far more difficult than maintaining them in the first place. For Prince William, sources suggest, this was never about a single visit or a single name. It was about a pattern, a slow, steady expansion that risked altering the very structure he is expected to inherit. The monarchy, as it has been passed down through generations, is not just a family, it is an institution bound by rules that often appear rigid but exist for a reason. And when those rules begin to bend, even slightly, the consequences can ripple far beyond the immediate moment. Because history has shown that the monarchy does not fracture suddenly, it shifts gradually, almost silently, until one day the change becomes impossible to ignore. And perhaps that is what made this situation so significant. It wasn't loud, it wasn't public, but it was persistent. A quiet evolution happening behind closed doors, unnoticed by many but impossible to overlook for those paying attention. And in that persistence lay the real danger, not of scandal, but of transformation. Because once access becomes normalized, once presence becomes expected, reversing that shift requires more than a simple decision. It requires a statement, a line drawn with absolute clarity. And as the weight of that realization began to settle within the palace, the discomfort that had once been whispered could no longer remain contained. What began as quiet discomfort would soon escalate into something far more serious, something the palace could no longer ignore. At first, it was subtle, an extra name on a guest list, a quiet stay extended by a few days. But insiders began to notice a pattern. And patterns inside the monarchy are never accidental. By early 2026, what had once been dismissed as harmless inclusion was being reinterpreted as something else entirely. Reports suggest that what appeared to be minor adjustments, an additional night here, an informal visit there, were quietly forming a sequence that could no longer be ignored. Those familiar with internal scheduling began to see overlaps that didn't align with traditional practice, moments where presence lingered longer than expected, where departures were delayed without clear explanation. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, but it was consistent. And consistency, within an institution built on rigid precedent, carries meaning. Insiders whisper that extended stays by Camilla's relatives were becoming increasingly normalized, shifting from rare exceptions into something closer to routine. At first, this raised little concern. After all, private family moments have always existed behind palace walls. But what unsettled those paying attention was not the presence itself, it was the frequency, the quiet repetition that suggested something more deliberate. Because in a system where access is carefully rationed, repetition signals acceptance. And acceptance, once established, is difficult to reverse. What had once required special clearance reportedly began to pass with less scrutiny, as if the boundaries themselves were slowly softening. Alongside these extended stays came another shift, one that proved even more difficult to ignore. Reports indicate that access was no longer confined to traditional guest areas. Certain individuals were seen, according to various interpretations, moving through spaces typically reserved for senior royals or tightly controlled operations. Not openly, not in ways that would immediately trigger alarm, but enough to raise questions among those responsible for maintaining the invisible structure of the institution. Because within the monarchy, space is hierarchy. Where one is allowed to stand, sit, or remain is never accidental. It is defined, protected, and understood without needing to be spoken aloud. And when those unspoken rules begin to blur, the implications ripple far beyond a single visit. Administrative staff, often the first to notice such shifts, reportedly began raising quiet concerns through internal channels. Not accusations, but observations. Patterns that didn't align. Records that required clarification. Small inconsistencies that, when viewed individually, seemed insignificant but when placed together, formed something far more troubling. Security logs, according to sources close to palace operations, began reflecting unusual activity. Entries and exits that extended beyond expected timelines. Movements that suggested a level of familiarity not typically granted. And while none of these instances alone constituted a breach, collectively they painted a picture that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Meanwhile, media insiders, those who exist just outside the palace walls, close enough to sense shifts but distant enough to speculate, began hinting at what they described as overreach. Not in bold headlines, but in cautious language, in carefully phrased commentary that suggested something was evolving behind the scenes. They spoke of blurred boundaries, of influence expanding quietly, of a dynamic that was beginning to challenge the traditional framework of royal access. And while these whispers never reached the level of confirmation, they added pressure to a situation already growing more complex by the day. Because in the world of the monarchy, perception often carries as much weight as reality. For those within the institution, the question was no longer whether something was changing, but how far it had already gone. And more importantly, whether it could still be contained. Because history has shown that the most significant shifts rarely arrive with warning. They build slowly, almost invisibly, until the moment they cross a line that cannot be uncrossed. And by the time that line becomes visible, the response is no longer optional. It is inevitable. And then, something happened that forced the issue out of whispers and into decisive action. There are moments in royal history when everything changes, and those moments rarely happen in public. According to sources, one such incident unfolded behind closed doors, involving access that should never have been granted. It was brief, it was contained, but it was enough. Because from that point on, the response was no longer a question of if but when. Reports suggest the situation centered on a moment of entry, an instance where presence crossed into territory that had long been understood as off-limits, not by written rule alone, but by tradition so deeply embedded it rarely needed to be enforced. Insiders whisper that what occurred was not loud, not confrontational, but unmistakable in its implications. A line had been crossed, quietly but definitively. And those who witnessed or later reviewed the circumstances understood immediately that this was different from anything that had come before. Various interpretations of the incident describe a setting where access was assumed rather than granted, where familiarity appeared to override protocol, even if only for a brief window of time. And within the monarchy, even a brief deviation carries weight, because these are not casual spaces. They are structured environments where every movement, every presence, is part of a larger system of order. To step outside that system even unintentionally is to disrupt a balance that has been maintained across generations. Those familiar with palace operations suggest that the response behind the scenes was immediate, though carefully contained. No public acknowledgement, no outward reaction. But internally, the shift was undeniable. A senior royal, according to multiple sources, was made aware almost instantly. Not through rumor, not through speculation, but through direct reporting channels that exist precisely for moments like this. And what followed was not outrage but calculation. Because within the monarchy, reaction is never impulsive. It is measured, deliberate, and often far more consequential than it appears on the surface. The information moved quickly through the highest levels of the institution, reaching those responsible for safeguarding its structure. And with that awareness came a realization that could no longer be ignored. An emergency internal review was reportedly initiated, though not in a way that would attract attention. It unfolded quietly, behind the same closed doors where the original incident had taken place. Administrative records were examined, access logs revisited, patterns that had once been considered minor were re-evaluated under a new light. What had seemed like isolated occurrences now formed part of a larger narrative, one that suggested a gradual shift had already been underway. And as that narrative became clearer, so too did the need for action. Because this was no longer about a single moment. It was about what that moment revealed. Prince William, sources indicate, was briefed directly. Not through intermediaries, not through delayed reporting, but in real time. And those familiar with his approach suggest that what followed was not an emotional response, but a decisive one. He did not react outwardly. He did not escalate the situation publicly. Instead, he absorbed the information, assessed its implications, and began considering the steps required to restore balance. Because for him, this was not about confrontation, it was about control. About ensuring that the institution he is destined to lead remains defined by its rules, not reshaped by gradual exceptions. And as the details continued to surface, the tension within the palace reached a breaking point. Not explosive, not visible, but unmistakable. Conversations became more guarded, decisions more deliberate. The quiet unease that had been building for months now crystallized into something far more urgent. Because once a line has been crossed and acknowledged, it cannot simply be ignored. It demands a response. And within the monarchy, that response is never temporary. It is designed to endure. What followed wasn't emotional, it was strategic, precise, and completely irreversible. When Prince William finally acted, he didn't hesitate. There were no drawn-out discussions, no room for negotiation. The directive was clear, clinical, and absolute. And within hours, systems began to change quietly, efficiently, and with a finality that stunned even those closest to the decision. Reports suggest that what unfolded was not a reaction, but a pre-prepared mechanism, something designed long before it was ever activated. The instruction moved through the palace like a sealed order, precise in its language and unmistakable in its intent. This was not about adjustment, it was about correction. And once initiated, there was no space left for interpretation. Insiders whisper that enforcement began simultaneously across multiple royal residences, not sequentially, not tentatively, but all at once. Balmoral, Sandringham, Clarence House, each operating under its own internal rhythm, were suddenly aligned under a single directive that demanded immediate compliance. Security teams reportedly received updated clearance protocols that redefined access in stark terms. Names that had once existed within the system were removed, not flagged, not reviewed, but erased. Because within the monarchy, removal carries a meaning far stronger than restriction, it signals finality. And this time, that finality was unmistakable. Security clearance for Camilla's family members, according to various interpretations, was revoked without ceremony. No formal explanation, no transitional period, just a shift that moved from access to absence in a matter of hours. Those familiar with the process suggest that even long-standing informal privileges, those quiet allowances that often exist beneath official protocol, were stripped away as part of the same action. Because this was not about managing perception. It was about restoring boundaries. And boundaries, once reinforced, leave little room for exception. Guest privileges, once extended quietly and without scrutiny, were permanently removed. Not suspended, not under review, but concluded. Administrative systems were reportedly updated to reflect this change, ensuring that no future ambiguity could reopen the door that had just been closed. Estate management teams coordinated with security personnel, aligning operational details with the broader directive. Every layer of the institution, from scheduling to access control, moved in unison, creating a response that was as seamless as it was decisive. It was, as some insiders have described, a masterclass in silent enforcement and action so controlled that it left no visible disruption, yet altered everything beneath the surface. Prince William's role, according to sources close to palace operations, was not just authorizing but overseeing. He did not delegate the decision and step away. He remained engaged, ensuring that the directive was carried out exactly as intended. Because for him, this was not a symbolic gesture. It was structural, a recalibration of the system that defines who belongs within the inner framework of the monarchy and who does not. And once that framework is adjusted, reversing it becomes almost impossible. King Charles, reports suggest, was informed after the initial stages had already been set in motion. Not excluded, but not positioned as the primary decision-maker in that moment. And that detail, subtle as it may seem, carries its own weight, because it reflects a shift not just in action but in authority. A moment where the future of the institution began to assert itself in real time, independent yet still connected to the present. For Charles, this was not simply an administrative update, it was a reality he was now being asked to accept. And within the palace, the response was immediate but contained. No public acknowledgement, no visible reaction. But internally, the impact was undeniable. Conversation shifted. Alignments became clearer. The invisible structure that governs royal life had been reinforced with a precision that left no doubt about its intent. Because this was not just a decision, it was a declaration. A statement about where the line exists and who has the authority to draw it. But while the order was executed without hesitation, its consequences were only just beginning to unfold. Inside the palace, the atmosphere shifted overnight. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Doors closed more quickly. And for the first time in years, the divide between factions within the royal family became impossible to ignore. Reports suggest that what followed William's directive was not chaos, but something far more unsettling, a controlled silence that spread through the institution with quiet precision. Staff who once moved freely between discussions now measured every word, every glance, every interaction, as if the air itself had changed. Because within the monarchy, tension rarely announces itself loudly. It settles, it lingers, and then it reshapes everything beneath the surface. Insiders whisper that Camilla's reaction was immediate, though carefully contained within the private spaces of the palace. Shock, according to various interpretations, gave way quickly to anger not explosive, not public, but sharp and undeniable. Because this was not simply a personal slight, it was a structural shift that directly affected those closest to her. The removal of access, the quiet exclusion from spaces that had once been open, carried a message that could not be softened or reinterpreted. And for someone who had spent years navigating the delicate balance between personal position and institutional acceptance, the implications were profound. It was not just about where her family could no longer go. It was about what that absence now represented. For palace staff, the situation became increasingly complex. Those who had once facilitated visits, coordinated schedules, and maintained the quiet flow of private arrangements now found themselves caught between two forces: loyalty to individuals and loyalty to protocol. And in the monarchy, those two do not always align. Administrative aides reportedly faced difficult decisions, balancing long-standing relationships with the clear directives now in place. Security personnel, tasked with enforcing the new boundaries, operated with a heightened awareness that their actions carried more than procedural weight, they carried symbolic meaning. Every denied entry, every removed name, reinforced the reality that something fundamental had changed. Internal divisions, once subtle and unspoken, began to surface in ways that could no longer be ignored. Not through open conflict, but through alignment. Conversations became selective, alliances clearer. Those who supported the reinforcement of traditional boundaries stood firm in their position, while others, more closely tied to personal relationships, found themselves navigating a far more uncertain path. Because within the palace, unity has always been maintained through discretion. And when discretion begins to fracture, the divisions beneath it inevitably come into view. Beyond the palace walls, the ripple effect was already taking shape. Media insiders, drawing from fragments of information and carefully placed whispers, began to speculate on what had unfolded behind closed doors. The language remained cautious, but the tone shifted. Words like tension, realignment, and internal restructuring began to appear more frequently, hinting at a story that had yet to fully surface. For Camilla's family, the consequences extended beyond access. They touched on perception, on standing, on the quiet but powerful ways in which presence defines relevance within royal life. To be absent from those spaces is not simply to be excluded, it is to be repositioned. And perhaps that was the most significant shift of all. This was no longer just an internal matter. It was becoming a narrative, one that would shape how relationships within the monarchy were understood moving forward. Because once a line is drawn this clearly, it does more than separate, it defines. It signals where authority lies and how far it is willing to go to protect the structure it governs. And as that realization settled across every level of the institution, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not temporary. It was not negotiable. It was the beginning of something far more lasting. And at the center of it all stood a king forced to confront a reality he could no longer avoid. For King Charles, the decision was more than administrative, it was deeply personal. Torn between his role as monarch and his loyalty as a husband, he found himself navigating a situation with no easy resolution. Because this wasn't just about access anymore. It was about control and who truly held it. Reports suggest that when the full scope of William's directive became clear, Charles did not respond with immediate opposition, nor did he attempt to assert authority in the way many might have expected. Instead, those familiar with palace dynamics describe a measured silence, a pause that reflected not indecision, but calculation. Because for a king who has spent decades preparing to preserve the institution, every move carries weight far beyond the moment itself. And this moment, perhaps more than most, demanded restraint. Insiders whisper that Charles was acutely aware of what the decision represented. It was not simply a boundary being enforced, it was a signal that the future of the monarchy was already beginning to take shape under William's influence. And that reality placed him in an impossible position. To challenge the directive would risk undermining the very stability he is expected to protect. To support it fully, however, would come at a personal cost that could not be ignored. And so, he remained in that narrow space between action and acceptance, aware that either choice would carry consequences that could not be undone. Various interpretations suggest that his ability to reverse the decision was more limited than it might appear from the outside. Not because he lacked authority, but because authority within the monarchy is rarely exercised in isolation. It is shaped by precedent, by perception, and by the delicate balance between continuity and change. And in this case, reversing the directive would not simply restore access, it would disrupt a carefully executed assertion of structure, one that had already begun to settle into place. Those close to the institution suggest that Charles understood this, perhaps more clearly than anyone else, because he has seen throughout history how internal conflicts can fracture not just relationships, but the very foundation of the crown. And history, in moments like this, has a way of echoing. There have always been tensions within the royal family, moments where personal loyalty collided with institutional duty, where private relationships tested the limits of public responsibility. Charles himself is no stranger to such conflicts. But what makes this situation different, according to those who study the monarchy closely, is the timing. This is not a struggle between equals. It is a transition point. A moment where the next generation is beginning to define its boundaries, not through words, but through action. And that shift changes everything. Advisors, sources suggest, played a crucial role in shaping Charles's response. Their guidance, reportedly, was consistent stability must come first. Not appearance, not personal alignment, but the preservation of the institution's integrity. Because in a time when public scrutiny is constant and unforgiving, any sign of internal discord risks becoming something far larger than the issue itself. And so, the advice was clear: allow the directive to stand. Avoid escalation, maintain unity even if that unity exists more in form than in feeling. It was not an easy path, but it was, perhaps, the only one available. At the heart of it all lay a deeper concern, one that extended beyond the immediate situation. The monarchy's image, carefully maintained over generations, was now at stake in ways that could not be fully controlled. Because while the decision itself remained largely unseen by the public, its effects would inevitably ripple outward. And once those ripples begin, they are impossible to contain entirely. For Charles, this was not just a test of leadership. It was a test of endurance, of his ability to navigate a moment where personal and institutional lines had blurred beyond recognition. And so, he held his position. Not passive but restrained. Not disengaged but deliberate. Allowing the decision to settle, to take hold, to define the boundaries it was meant to reinforce. Because sometimes, within the monarchy, the most powerful action is not what is done but what is allowed to stand. And in this case, what stood was more than a directive. It was a shift in power, quietly acknowledged, carefully absorbed, and impossible to ignore. In the end, the decision would stand, but its meaning reached far beyond the individuals involved. What happened wasn't just a ban, it was a message, a declaration of where the future of the monarchy is headed and who will define it. Because in a system built on tradition, moments like this don't just resolve conflicts, they reshape the institution itself. Reports suggest that what unfolded behind palace walls was never intended to remain a temporary measure. It was designed to endure, to settle into the structure of royal life as something permanent, something that would quietly guide decisions long after the initial tension had faded. Because within the monarchy, the most powerful changes are rarely announced, they are absorbed, normalized, and eventually accepted as part of the order that governs everything else. And this, according to those familiar with the situation, was one of those changes. At the center of it stood Prince William, no longer simply observing or preparing, but actively shaping the framework he will one day inherit. Insiders whisper that this moment marked a turning point, not loud or ceremonial, but unmistakable in its intent. It was an assertion of authority that did not rely on titles or declarations, but on action. And action, within the monarchy, carries a weight that words often cannot match. Because to act is to define, to set a precedent that others must follow. And in doing so, William signaled something that had been building quietly for years, that the future of the institution will not be negotiated through sentiment, but structured through control. Central to that shift was a reinforcement of a principle that has always existed, though rarely tested so directly: the distinction between royal bloodline and external influence. For generations, that line has been maintained with careful precision, not as a matter of exclusion, but as a way of preserving identity. And when that line begins to blur, the response is rarely immediate, but it is inevitable. What this decision represents, according to various interpretations, is a return to that clarity. A reaffirmation that access to the inner workings of the monarchy is not simply a matter of proximity or relationship, but of position within a system that has been shaped over centuries. And once that clarity is restored, it becomes the foundation upon which everything else is built. For Camilla, the implications extend far beyond the immediate consequences. This was not just a moment of restriction, it was a recalibration of standing, one that will likely influence how her role is perceived moving forward. Reports suggest that while her position as queen remains unchanged, the boundaries surrounding her influence have been more clearly defined. And in an institution where perception is inseparable from reality, that distinction matters. Because influence within the monarchy is rarely about what is stated, it is about what is understood. And what is now understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, is where the limits lie. Beyond the palace, the narrative has already begun to take shape. Media speculation, fueled by fragments of information and carefully placed whispers, has created a version of events that continues to evolve. But as with many royal matters, the public story and the internal reality are not always aligned. What appears as a singular decision from the outside is, from within, part of a much larger shift, a gradual redefinition of authority that has been unfolding quietly over time. And it is within that quiet evolution that the true significance of this moment can be found. Because while the details may remain partially obscured, the direction is unmistakable. And perhaps that is the most important outcome of all. Not the immediate impact, not the personal consequences, but the precedent that has now been established. A line has been drawn not temporarily, not conditionally, but with a permanence that signals how similar situations will be handled in the future. Because within the monarchy, precedent is power. It shapes decisions, guides behavior, and ultimately defines the institution itself. And once a precedent is set at this level, it becomes part of the structure that future generations must navigate. So what remains is not just the memory of what happened, but the understanding of what it means. A shift that was quiet, controlled, and deeply significant. A moment where the balance between past and future tilted, not dramatically, but decisively. And in that shift, the monarchy revealed something essential about itself, that even in times of tension, it will choose structure over sentiment, clarity over compromise, and continuity over convenience. Because within the monarchy, access is never just access, it is power. And once that power is revoked, it is rarely ever returned. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.